Ethan Carter walked through the crowded halls of Ridgewood High School with his head down, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The faint scuff of his worn sneakers on the tile floor was lost amidst the echoing chatter and clamor of lockers slamming shut. He had perfected the art of invisibility, knowing that it was safer to blend into the background than to risk unwanted attention. Ridgewood was a place where weakness was an invitation to cruelty, and Ethan had been on the receiving end far too many times to test the waters again. At 17, Ethan was unremarkable by most accounts, a thin, bookish teenager with dark brown hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes. He wore glasses that slipped down his nose when he was nervous, which was often, and his clothes carried the faint scent of laundry detergent from his mother's diligent care. But beneath the timid exterior, there lingered a shadow of who he used to be, a kid who once believed in himself, in part because his father had believed in him. Ethan's father, Michael Carter, had been a local legend, a former boxing champion who had inspired his son with tales of grit and determination. Ethan could still recall the sound of his father's laughter, the steady cadence of his voice teaching him how to throw a proper jab, and the way his hands had steadied Ethan's during their backyard training sessions. Those memories felt like relics from another life, shattered the day Michael's heart gave out after a grueling match. Since his father's death, Ethan's world had narrowed to the four walls of his small home and the suffocating embrace of his mother, Mary. Her love had become a fortress, built to shield Ethan from the dangers she believed lurked everywhere. She had forbidden him from boxing, deeming it a barbaric sport that had stolen her husband. "Promise me, Ethan," she'd said with tears in her eyes. "Promise you'll never put those gloves on again." But Ethan's promise had come at a cost. Without the outlet of boxing, he had retreated into himself, his confidence eroding like a shoreline battered by relentless waves. He focused on academics, finding solace in science, a subject that made sense in a world that often didn't. Yet even in his favorite class, he couldn't escape the taunts. "Hey, Carter!" The voice boomed from behind, cutting through the din of the hallway. Ethan's shoulders tensed instinctively. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Brandon Miller. Brandon was the school's golden boy, the star quarterback with a jawline that seemed carved from stone and a smirk that made people either swoon or cower. His charisma masked a darker side, one that thrived on control and the humiliation of others. Today, Ethan was his target. A sharp shove sent Ethan stumbling into the row of lockers. His glasses slipped, and he barely caught them before they hit the ground. Laughter erupted around him, the kind of laughter that carried cruelty like a blade. "Come on, Carter," Brandon said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why don't you find a nice little corner for nerds like you?" "Oh, wait. You already have." More laughter followed, a cruel chorus that rang in Ethan's ears. Ethan straightened himself, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. He tried to focus on the locker in front of him, to will himself invisible, but the sting of humiliation burned too brightly. He didn't dare look Brandon in the eye. "Don't you have anything to say, Carter? Or are you too scared?" Brandon leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "That's what I thought." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, leaving him breathless. Brandon stepped back, satisfied with his dominance, and the crowd began to disperse, their interest already waning. That night, Ethan sat in the dimly lit basement of his home, his sanctuary from a world that felt increasingly hostile. The room smelled faintly of dust and aged wood, the air heavy with the echoes of a past life. In the corner stood a heavy punching bag, worn and frayed from years of use. Beside it, on a shelf cluttered with old trophies and photographs, rested a pair of boxing gloves, his father's gloves. Ethan stared at them, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, shame, and something else, a spark of defiance he hadn't felt in years. He crossed the room, his footsteps hesitant but purposeful, and reached for the gloves. They felt heavier than he remembered, their leather cool and worn against his skin. As he slipped them on, memories flooded back. His father's voice, patient and encouraging. "Boxing isn't just about fighting, Ethan. It's about discipline, about knowing your strength and using it wisely." Ethan squared his stance and threw a tentative jab at the bag. The impact reverberated through his arms, a jolt of energy that sent his heart racing. He hit the bag again, harder this time, channeling the anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface. Each punch felt like a small rebellion against the helplessness that had defined him for so long. The session left him breathless, his muscles trembling with exertion. But for the first time in years, he felt something akin to hope, a flicker of belief that he could change his story, that he didn't have to remain a victim. Upstairs, the sound of his mother moving about reminded him of the delicate balance he had to maintain. Mary would never approve of him boxing again, but Ethan knew this was something he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he had rediscovered a piece of himself. As he peeled off the gloves and set them back on the shelf, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would train in secret, away from prying eyes and his mother's watchful gaze. He would become stronger, not just to defend himself, but to reclaim the confidence and self-respect he had lost. Because Ethan Carter was done being a target. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark ignite within him, a spark that could grow into a fire. The dim glow of Ethan's desk lamp flickered as he studied his physics notes late into the night. The equations blurred together, his focus interrupted by the lingering adrenaline from the basement training session. His arms ached pleasantly, a reminder of the punches he'd thrown earlier, and his mind buzzed with a mix of fear and determination. If his mother discovered what he was doing, her disappointment would be unbearable. But for Ethan, this was about more than boxing, it was about reclaiming control. The next morning, Ethan rose early, slipping quietly into the basement before school. He wrapped his hands clumsily with old gauze he had found in his father's things. The punching bag swayed gently as he hit it, each strike slightly more controlled than the last. The heavy thuds echoed in the quiet room, blending with the faint chirping of birds outside. He practiced until his knuckles stung, his breath coming in sharp bursts. When his mother called him for breakfast, Ethan hurried upstairs, careful to wash away any evidence of his training. Mary was bustling around the kitchen, setting a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. "You look tired," she said, her eyes narrowing in concern. "Just stayed up studying," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. He couldn't risk her asking more questions. At school, the day unfolded in its usual pattern. Ethan kept his head down, his steps hurried between classes, avoiding the predatory eyes of Brandon Miller. But something had shifted. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just running from the next confrontation, he was preparing for it. Brandon, however, wasn't one to let his prey escape for long. During lunch, Ethan's reprieve was shattered when Brandon swaggered into the cafeteria with his usual entourage. Spotting Ethan at a table near the back, Brandon grinned like a wolf closing in on a lamb. "Hey, Carter," Brandon called, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of half the room. He strode over, snatching Ethan's sandwich from his tray and taking a bite. "Hope you don't mind. I skipped breakfast." The table erupted in laughter, but Ethan's jaw clenched. For a moment, he considered standing up, but his body stayed frozen. Brandon leaned closer, his tone mocking. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Ethan forced himself to look Brandon in the eye, something he rarely dared to do. His voice was steady, though quiet. "Maybe you should worry less about my lunch and more about fixing whatever's broken in your own life." The cafeteria fell silent, the tension crackling like a live wire. For a split second, Brandon's confident smirk faltered, replaced by something darker. But he recovered quickly, grabbing Ethan's notebook and tearing it in half. The sound of ripping paper was a declaration of power. "You'll regret that," Brandon said coldly before turning and leaving with his friends. Ethan gathered the pieces of his notebook, his hands trembling. Despite the humiliation, a flicker of pride burned in his chest. He had stood up to Brandon, even if only with words. That evening, Ethan returned to his basement sanctuary. The shredded notebook sat on a nearby table as a reminder of the day's events, fueling his determination. He worked tirelessly, practicing the movements his father had taught him years ago. Jabs, crosses, hooks, each punch was sharper, more deliberate than the last. In the days that followed, Ethan's routine became a delicate balancing act. He pored over his schoolwork in the evenings, trained in secret before dawn, and endured Brandon's increasingly aggressive antics during the day. The school had noticed the escalating tension between them, with teachers exchanging worried glances but doing little to intervene. One afternoon, Brandon escalated his bullying to a new level. Ethan was leaving the science lab when Brandon cornered him in the hallway. Books spilled from Ethan's arms as Brandon shoved him against the wall. "You think you're brave now, Carter? Talking back to me like that?" Brandon's voice was low, almost a growl. Ethan met Brandon's glare with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Maybe I've just had enough," he said, his voice firm. The words hung in the air, a challenge neither of them could ignore. Brandon's fist clenched, but before he could act, a teacher's voice called down the hall, dispersing the crowd that had gathered to watch. As Brandon walked away, his eyes promised that the confrontation was far from over. Ethan leaned against the wall, his breath uneven but his resolve unshaken. He knew he had crossed a line with Brandon, one that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, as Ethan trained in the basement, he found his thoughts drifting to Brandon. He remembered seeing the star quarterback in the parking lot a few weeks ago, arguing with his parents. The shouting had been loud enough to draw stares from passers-by. Brandon's life wasn't as perfect as he made it seem. Still, Ethan couldn't afford to dwell on empathy. The stakes were too high, and Brandon wouldn't back down. Ethan needed to be ready, not just to defend himself, but to prove to everyone, including himself, that he wasn't weak. As he landed a final punch on the bag, the chain creaked ominously, the bag swinging wildly. Sweat dripped down Ethan's face, but he didn't wipe it away. Instead, he stood there, fists clenched, breathing hard. For the first time, he felt the strength his father had always believed in. Upstairs, his mother called for him to come to bed. Ethan glanced at the gloves on his hands, then at the clock. It was late, and he had school in the morning, but he didn't care. He wasn't just training his body. He was rebuilding the pieces of himself that had been broken for so long. The battle with Brandon loomed closer with every passing day, and Ethan could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the storm. He was ready to face it. The locker room was quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Most of the football team had already left after practice, their voices and laughter trailing into the distance. Ethan hesitated just outside the door, gripping his books tightly. He had taken a detour to avoid Brandon and his friends, but the empty corridor forced him toward the locker room as his only escape route. Inside, Brandon was alone, rummaging through his gym bag. The sight of Ethan stepping in made him pause. His eyes lit up with a kind of malevolent glee that sent a chill through Ethan's spine. "Well, well," Brandon said, slamming his locker shut. "If it isn't Carter, walking into the lion's den. Brave or just stupid?" Ethan swallowed hard but didn't back out. He couldn't afford to show fear. Brandon's predatory grin widened as he took a step closer. "Let me guess," Brandon taunted, circling Ethan slowly. "You think standing up to me in front of everyone makes you some kind of hero now?" Ethan tightened his grip on his books. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I just want you to leave me alone." Brandon laughed, a low, humorless sound that echoed in the confined space. "Oh, you're done hiding now? Guess I'll have to remind you why you don't mess with me." Before Ethan could react, Brandon shoved him hard, sending his books scattering across the tiled floor. Ethan stumbled but caught himself, his heart pounding as he straightened up. Brandon stepped forward again, his hand shoving Ethan's shoulder. "Come on, Carter," Brandon said, his voice dripping with derision. "Do something. Show me how tough you are." Something inside Ethan snapped. He had spent weeks training, preparing himself for this moment. The weight of every insult, every shove, and every cruel word pressed on him like a dam about to break. He wasn't going to back down anymore. Brandon's next shove was met with an instinctive reaction. Ethan's fist shot out, his knuckles connecting with Brandon's jaw in a solid, clean punch. The impact sent Brandon stumbling backward into the row of lockers with a metallic crash. For a moment, the room fell silent. Brandon touched his jaw, his expression shifting from shock to rage. "You're going to regret that," he growled, lunging at Ethan. Ethan braced himself, his training taking over as Brandon swung wildly. He dodged to the side, his footwork quick and deliberate, and countered with a jab to Brandon's ribs. The sound of the hit echoed in the locker room, followed by a pained grunt from Brandon. The door burst open as two of Brandon's teammates entered, their laughter dying instantly as they took in the scene. One of them, a tall linebacker named Derek, hurried forward. "What the hell's going on?" Brandon pushed himself off the lockers, his face flushed with fury. "Carter here thinks he can play tough guy," he spat, pointing at Ethan. Derek's eyes darted between them, his confusion evident. "Brandon, what are you doing, man? This is stupid." Ethan's breathing was ragged, his fists still clenched. His knuckles throbbed from the punch, but he didn't drop his guard. Brandon, however, wasn't done. "This isn't over," Brandon hissed, shoving Derek aside as he stormed out of the locker room. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Ethan's labored breaths. Derek looked at him, a mix of shock and something else, respect. "How'd you do that?" Ethan shook his head, bending to pick up his scattered books. "Doesn't matter." "It kinda does," Derek said, leaning against a locker. "Brandon's not used to people fighting back." Ethan stuffed his books into his bag without another word and left the room. His hands trembled as he walked, the adrenaline coursing through him in waves. He wasn't sure what scared him more, what he had just done or what Brandon would do in response. Word of the altercation spread quickly the next day. By the time Ethan arrived at school, the hallways buzzed with whispers and stolen glances in his direction. For the first time, he wasn't just invisible. He was the center of attention. "Did you hear?" Carter knocked Brandon down in the locker room. Brandon's furious. He's not going to let this slide. Ethan kept his head high, refusing to let the stares and murmurs get to him. Part of him felt a swell of pride, but it was tempered by the gnawing anticipation of Brandon's retaliation. Brandon, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. His absence was as palpable as his presence, leaving an uneasy tension in the air. Ethan couldn't decide if it was a good sign or a bad one. In the cafeteria, Ethan sat alone at his usual table, his back to the wall. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, his muscles tense as he scanned the room. Derek approached cautiously, setting his tray down across from Ethan. "Mind if I sit?" Derek asked, his tone unusually neutral. Ethan shrugged, wary but curious. Derek leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, Brandon's been acting out of control lately. We've all noticed it. I'm not saying what you did was smart, but it wasn't wrong either." Ethan frowned. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to be careful," Derek said simply. "Brandon's not just angry, he's embarrassed. And that makes him dangerous." Ethan nodded, his suspicions confirmed. "I can handle it." Derek sighed, shaking his head. "I hope so. But you're in the middle of something bigger than just a fight. You've got the whole school watching now." Ethan mulled over Derek's words as he finished his meal. The fight in the locker room had been a turning point, but it was clear this was far from over. Brandon wasn't going to let it go, and Ethan knew he needed to be ready for whatever came next. That night, as he trained in the basement, Ethan pushed himself harder than ever. The punching bag swung wildly under his blows, each strike fueled by the fear and determination swirling inside him. He wasn't just fighting Brandon anymore. He was fighting the version of himself that had always backed down. By the time he finished, his muscles ached and his knuckles were raw, but his resolve had never been stronger. The confrontation with Brandon had been inevitable, and Ethan knew the next one would be even more intense. As he stood in the dimly lit basement, his reflection in the cracked mirror caught his eye. For the first time, he saw more than a timid, scared boy. He saw someone who could fight back, someone who wouldn't let fear control him anymore. Ethan's mornings began earlier now. The darkened sky outside his window was the only witness to the grueling training sessions in the basement. Each punch, each movement became sharper, honed by the growing sense of inevitability. He wasn't just preparing for Brandon anymore. He was proving something to himself, that he could endure, that he could transform fear into strength. But for all his focus, Doubt lingered like a shadow. It followed him into his classes, during lunch, and even as he walked home from school. The looks of his classmates, some impressed, some curious, others disapproving, gnawed at him. For every person who admired his defiance, there was another who whispered that he was only making things worse. "You think this is going to end with a fight?" his closest friend, Josh, asked one evening after school. They were sitting on the curb outside Ethan's house, the sky painted in streaks of pink and orange. "It's not about the fight," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It's about not being afraid anymore." Josh sighed, leaning back on his hands. "I get it. But Brandon's not just another bully, Ethan. He's got everyone fooled into thinking he's untouchable. If you keep pushing, he won't just stop at humiliating you." Ethan looked at Josh, his voice firmer than he expected. "Then let him try." The words hung in the air, heavy with determination, but even as he spoke them, Ethan couldn't ignore the weight in his chest. He wasn't blind to the risks, but something deeper urged him forward, a voice that refused to let him back down now. At school, the tension simmered just beneath the surface. Brandon was quieter than usual, his anger boiling over in subtle ways. His friends seemed wary, exchanging glances but saying nothing when he slammed his locker shut or muttered curses under his breath. One day after practice, Ethan saw Brandon standing alone near the bleachers. His helmet dangled from his hand, his expression unusually vacant. Ethan paused, hidden behind the corner of the school's gym, watching as Brandon punched the bleacher railing. The sound of his fist meeting metal echoed, sharp and angry, as though he was trying to beat back something he couldn't control. It was the first time Ethan saw the cracks in Brandon's armor. The invincible facade seemed to slip, revealing the weight the other boy carried. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a flicker of understanding. Whatever demons Brandon fought, they weren't as different from his own as he had once thought. But understanding wasn't enough to change what was coming. The whole school could feel it now. The air was thick with anticipation, conversations laced with speculation about when the inevitable showdown between Ethan and Brandon would occur. Ethan's mother, Mary, began to notice the shift in her son. "You've been different lately," she said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. Her voice was cautious, probing. "Is everything okay at school?" Ethan hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "It's fine," he said, too quickly to sound convincing. Mary frowned, setting down her glass. "Ethan, you know you can tell me if something's wrong." "I said it's fine," he snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness in his tone. Her eyes softened, but her concern deepened. "You've been working yourself too hard. Staying up late, disappearing in the mornings." "I just don't want you to," she trailed off, her voice catching. "I'm not Dad," Ethan said quietly, his voice strained but firm. "I'm not going to get hurt." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached for his hand across the table. "That's not what I'm afraid of, Ethan. I just don't want you to lose yourself trying to be something you think you have to be." Ethan nodded, but he didn't say more. He couldn't explain what drove him now, not in a way she would understand. The next day, Derek approached Ethan again in the cafeteria, his expression grim. "Brandon's planning something," he said, sitting across from Ethan uninvited. Ethan barely looked up from his lunch. "He always is." "This is different," Derek pressed, lowering his voice. "He's been angrier than I've ever seen him. You need to watch your back." Ethan met Derek's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I'm not scared of him anymore." Derek sighed, leaning back. "You should be. He's not just trying to hurt you, he's trying to prove he's still in control." Ethan didn't respond, but the warning stayed with him long after Derek left. Control. That was what it always came down to. Brandon needed to feel powerful, needed to remind everyone, including himself, that he couldn't be challenged. That evening, Ethan pushed himself harder than ever in the basement. He wrapped his knuckles tightly, ignoring the sting of his raw skin as he pummeled the heavy bag. His punches came faster, harder, each one a cathartic release of fear, anger, and determination. Sweat dripped from his brow, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He didn't stop until his arms felt like lead, until his legs threatened to give out beneath him. Leaning against the wall, he closed his eyes, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had learned in this very room. Strength wasn't just about physical power, it was about resilience, about refusing to let the world break you. As Ethan climbed the stairs to his room, he paused at the top, looking back at the basement door. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he felt something else too, a quiet, steely resolve that had taken root deep within him. He was no longer the boy who cowered in hallways or let fear dictate his actions. He didn't know what the next confrontation would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to face it. The gymnasium was eerily silent as Ethan stepped inside, the late afternoon light slanting through the high windows to cast long, golden shadows on the polished floor. His footsteps echoed faintly, and the distant hum of the school's heating system was the only sound. He'd received the message an hour ago, a note shoved into his locker, scrawled in Brandon's bold, angry handwriting. "Jim. After school. Let's settle this." Ethan had known this moment was coming, the inevitability of it looming over him for weeks. But now that it was here, his heart hammered in his chest, a relentless rhythm that he couldn't ignore. Brandon stood on the far side of the gym, leaning casually against the bleachers, as if he hadn't been waiting at all. He wore his Letterman jacket unzipped, the sleeves pushed up, and his face held the same smug confidence that had always made Ethan feel small. But not today. "You showed up," Brandon said, his voice breaking the silence. He straightened, taking a step forward. "Didn't think you had it in you." Ethan dropped his bag near the wall, his movements deliberate. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Brandon." Brandon smirked, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. "That's your first mistake. You should be." The space between them seemed to shrink as Brandon stepped closer. Ethan could feel the weight of Brandon's presence, the unspoken threat in every movement. But he stood his ground, his hands clenching at his sides. "I don't know what your problem is," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "But I'm done letting you take it out on me." Brandon's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something raw and vulnerable flash across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by anger. "You don't know anything about me," Brandon snapped, his voice rising. "You think you're some kind of hero now? Standing up to the big bad bully." "This isn't about being a hero," Ethan shot back. "This is about you thinking you can push people around because you're too scared to deal with your own crap." The words hit harder than any punch could have, and Brandon's face darkened. "Shut up," he said, his voice low and threatening. Ethan didn't back down. "Why?" "Because it's true." Brandon lunged without warning, his fist swinging toward Ethan with the force of years of pent-up frustration. But Ethan was ready. He sidestepped quickly, the months of training sharpening his reflexes. The fight began in earnest, raw and unrelenting. Brandon's strength was undeniable, his punches heavy and aggressive, but Ethan had precision on his side. He moved with calculated purpose, dodging and countering, each strike a testament to the hours he had spent in the basement. "Come on, Carter," Brandon shouted, his breath labored as he threw another punch. "Fight me." "I am fighting you," Ethan yelled back, landing a sharp jab to Brandon's side. Brandon staggered but recovered quickly, his fury driving him forward. They circled each other, the tension crackling like electricity. For every wild swing Brandon threw, Ethan responded with measured precision, his movements guided by muscle memory and focus. "You think this makes you better than me?" Brandon growled, his voice laced with bitterness. "This isn't about being better," Ethan said, ducking under a punch and landing a blow to Brandon's shoulder. "It's about not letting you control me anymore." The fight wore on, their breaths ragged, sweat dripping from their faces. The gym felt suffocating, the weight of their unspoken struggles filling the space. Brandon swung again, his punch grazing Ethan's cheek. The pain flared, but it only sharpened Ethan's resolve. He retaliated with a quick combination of jabs, forcing Brandon to step back. But then something shifted. Brandon's movements slowed, his attacks growing less precise. His shoulders sagged, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. Ethan hesitated, lowering his fists slightly. "You don't get it," Brandon muttered, his voice cracking. He sank to his knees, his hands clutching his hair. "You don't know what it's like." Ethan froze, the anger and adrenaline draining from him as he watched Brandon crumble. The boy who had terrorized him for months now looked broken, vulnerable in a way Ethan had never imagined. "Brandon," Ethan said cautiously, stepping closer. Brandon looked up, his face etched with frustration and despair. "Everything's falling apart, Carter. My parents, the team, me. I can't fix any of it." His voice cracked, and he slammed his fist into the floor. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding for a different reason now. He could walk away, leave Brandon to deal with his mess alone. But something in him wouldn't let him. "We're all dealing with something," Ethan said quietly, kneeling a few feet away. "But beating up other people isn't going to make it go away." Brandon laughed bitterly, his head hanging low. "You think I don't know that? I don't know how to stop." Ethan reached out, offering his hand. "Then maybe you need help. And not the kind you get from punching someone." For a long moment, Brandon stared at the outstretched hand. His pride warred with the crushing weight of his problems, but finally he reached out, grasping Ethan's hand with trembling fingers. As Ethan helped him to his feet, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve. The fight was over, but something more important had begun, a fragile understanding between two boys who had been battling far more than just each other. "Let's figure it out," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Together." Brandon nodded, the weight on his shoulders seeming to lift just slightly. And for the first time, Ethan felt the power of something stronger than any punch he could throw, the courage to forgive. The weeks after the fight in the gym felt like the calm after a storm. The school buzzed with muted whispers about what had happened, but no one dared to ask Ethan or Brandon directly. Both boys had become figures of intrigue, the tension between them replaced by an unspoken truce that left their classmates guessing. Ethan walked through the halls with a quiet confidence he hadn't known in years. He still preferred the background, but he no longer shrank from the occasional stares or murmured conversations. Something inside him had changed, the fear and self-doubt that had once consumed him replaced by a newfound strength. Brandon, on the other hand, was noticeably subdued. The swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by a thoughtful, almost solemn demeanor. He still commanded attention, but it wasn't through intimidation. His teammates noticed the difference, and though they didn't say it aloud, they respected him more for it. One afternoon, Ethan found Brandon waiting for him outside the science lab. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, but his expression was less hostile than usual. "Carter," Brandon said, nodding as Ethan approached. Ethan stopped, his guard still partially up. "What's up?" Brandon hesitated, then said, "I owe you an apology. For everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan studied Brandon's face, searching for any trace of sarcasm, but there was none. "Thanks," Ethan replied after a moment. "I appreciate it." Brandon nodded, glancing away. "I've been, talking to the counselor. Trying to get my head straight." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable but determined. "It's not easy, but it's better than what I was doing." Ethan felt a flicker of admiration. "It took courage to face yourself, to admit you needed help." "That's good, Brandon. Really good." Brandon shrugged, but his eyes met Ethan's with an honesty that hadn't been there before. "I still don't get why you helped me that day. You could have just walked away." Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Because I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning. And because I figured maybe you didn't need another fight. You needed a way out." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thanks for that." The conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Brandon and Ethan didn't become friends in the traditional sense, but they developed a mutual respect that extended beyond words. They worked together in small ways, supporting each other's growth without making a spectacle of it. Brandon began volunteering with the school's anti-bullying program, a move that surprised everyone but made sense to him. He wanted to make up for the damage he'd caused, to use his influence for something positive. Ethan watched from a distance, impressed but unwilling to draw attention to it. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself drawn back to the punching bag in his basement, not out of anger but as a way to connect with the part of himself he had rediscovered. His movements were more controlled now, his strikes deliberate, each punch a testament to his growth. One evening, his mother found him in the basement, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Ethan," she said, her voice hesitant, "I thought you promised." "I know," Ethan interrupted gently, setting the gloves down. "But this isn't about fighting, Mom. It's about everything Dad taught me. Discipline, focus, strength. It's helping me, not hurting me." Mary's eyes softened, tears welling up as she stepped closer. "I just don't want to lose you," she said quietly. "You won't," Ethan promised, his voice steady. "I'm doing this for me, but I'm also doing it for him. To honor what he believed in." She nodded, pulling him into a tight hug. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Ethan said, and for the first time, he felt her trust. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's transformation became evident to everyone around him. His classmates no longer saw him as the timid boy they could ignore. Teachers noticed his confidence, his willingness to speak up in class. Even his bullies turned spectators couldn't deny the respect he had earned. One day, Brandon approached Ethan during lunch, a stack of flyers in his hand. "We're starting a mentoring program," Brandon said, handing one to Ethan. "For kids who need a little extra support. I thought you might want to help out." Ethan studied the flyer, the words "Peer Mentorship Program" printed in bold letters. He looked up at Brandon, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You really are turning things around, huh?" Brandon smirked, but it lacked his usual arrogance. "Trying to." "You in?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I'm in." The program became a success, drawing in students from all walks of life. Ethan and Brandon worked together, using their experiences to help others find their strength. It wasn't always easy. Old habits died hard, and the past had a way of resurfacing, but they kept at it, driven by the impact they could see. By the end of the school year, Ridgewood High felt like a different place. The halls that had once echoed with whispers and cruelty now buzzed with collaboration and understanding. Programs addressing mental health and bullying became a cornerstone of the school's culture, inspired by the unexpected partnership of Ethan Carter and Brandon Miller. Ethan stood in the gym one last time, the sunlight streaming through the windows just as it had on the day of their fight. Brandon joined him, his hands in his pockets, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We've come a long way," Brandon said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "Yeah," Ethan agreed, looking around. "We have." They didn't need to say more. The silence between them was one of understanding, of shared struggles and triumphs. As they left the gym together, the echoes of their footsteps faded into the noise of the bustling school, a reminder that even the darkest battles could lead to brighter horizons. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.